Self-deprecation without confidence is self-flagellation. If you're not truly confident, don't be self-deprecating.
You've been researching and writing about persuasion, speeches all over the world, big-time TED Talk, masterclass.
We're all in sales now. And I wanted to make a very robust case for why that was true. We spend too much of our time trying to change people's minds and not enough time making it easy for them to act.
Wow, that really connects.
When do you appeal to people's heads and when do you appeal to people's hearts? Bosses tend to group people into two categories. People who make my life easier, people who make my life harder. But what's abundant are opinions. And so they're not worth that much. What's scarce is possibility.
So you've been researching and writing about persuasion and motivation, books and speeches all over the world, big-time TED Talk, masterclass, all this stuff. And I'm curious, from the beginning stages of your career, you're working as a speechwriter for Al Gore. What did you learn from that experience about motivation and persuasion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I did sort of took a roundabout path to what I've been doing for the last 20 years, and that I went to law school thinking I was going to get a job in politics and policy, and I ended up in a kind of a half-assed way as a speechwriter, and then having done that for a while, I realized that I didn't want to work in politics the rest of my life, and what I really wanted to do was write my own stuff. And so in the years that I was a speechwriter, I'm not sure I learned that much about motivation. I think that well, maybe there's something personal motivation, because one of the things about speech writing is that you're frequently on deadline and you don't have the luxury to wait till you're inspired. And so the motivation is doing the job well, whether you're in the mood or not. And I actually think that's a pretty important lesson in writing or in any other kind of endeavor. On the persuasion side, yeah, there are probably a lot of lessons. It sounds simple-minded, but one of them is as obvious as this sounds, is the importance of clarity and simplicity. Clarity and simplicity, clarity and simplicity. There's so many speeches that I've heard from politicians and so forth that really don't have a point, that wander around, that aren't concise and clear and focused. And I think that working as a speechwriter for several years made me perhaps a little bit more conscious of audience. And I say that, and I might think about audience a little bit more as a writer than someone who came to this job without having that experience, without having the experience for years, writing something, seeing someone else deliver it, and being in the room to understand that worked, that didn't work, that made sense to people, that confused them. So having that sense of audience, I think, was really, really helpful for me in doing what I'm doing now.
So there are, Dan, a lot of leaders listening who do QBRs, quarterly business reviews. They do town hall meetings with their entire companies. They're giving speeches. And I've been in those rooms. I'm sure you've probably sat in on some of those rooms, or maybe they've spoken before you at a company event where you're the keynote. And a lot of people, because they're focused on other parts of their job, they're not very good at that. They're not good presentation givers. They're not good speakers. Sometimes they're not prepared enough because they're doing other things. So knowing what you know about speech writing and delivering speeches and persuading people and moving them, what at a high level, what are some of the general pieces of advice you'd give to that senior VP who's preparing for the town hall, who wants to move people in a positive direction, set the vision, and leave them leaving the room like inspired to go do the work?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a few things there, Ryan. One of them is, again, fairly straightforward, fairly simple-minded. It goes back at some level to Stephen Covey from 30 years ago, which is to begin with the end in mind. That when you give a speech, you typically, unlike writing necessarily, unlike writing prose, writing for people to read on their own, it's a different beast altogether. And so when you give a speech, ultimately you really want people to do something at the end. That doing something is not saying, hey, that guy's smart or that woman is smart, but especially in the role that you're describing, Brian, the you want people to do something at the end of it. And going in with that as the at the outset, that is having that goal drive what you say. And what that does is that gives you a clarity that you wouldn't have if you just simply meander your way into it. That's one thing that I would say. The second thing, you alluded to it, is preparation. I'm not a fan of winging it. Now, I think one of the things that one of the things you see a little bit of lately is, especially with like TED Talks, is that they're so shellacked. They're so prepared. They're so rehearsed that you just want to gag. And so I think you can go too far on that. But preparing is really essential. And I guess the third thing would be to sound like yourself. Don't try to sound like somebody else. So, you have a lot of like tech CEOs who go and do these presentations and they try to be, Steve Jobs, and they end up being like a poor man Steve Jobs, that they're in their effort to mirror Steve Jobs. They only demonstrate how far away from being Steve Jobs they are. And so what you want to do is you just want to be the best version of yourself. Don't try to sound like anybody else. And so I think those three things can be really helpful in any leader in giving any kind of speech. And this could be somebody who's giving some opening remarks at their local PTA. This could be somebody who is at their church or their synagogue or their mosque, trying to get volunteers. It doesn't necessarily, it's not anything that only certain exalted people can do. It's for anybody who wants to give a speech in front of a large group, in front of, more than 2 or 3 people, and wants to get them to do something, wants to get them to act.
Be authentic, sound like yourself, be you, be prepared, and have a goal. Begin with the end in mind so people know what they are to do.
I think the word authentic, it sort of bugs me. I think the word authentic has been dumbed down. What you have now is you have a lot of manufactured authenticity. You have a lot of people calculating how they can sound authentic. My view is essentially to sound like yourself. And and don't try to sound like anybody else, just sound like yourself. And I guess going back to your first question, it is something else that I've learned from writing speeches earlier in my life, is that you develop an ear for how people really talk. And one of the things that I would do, we happen to be talking in the midst of a very politically newsworthy summer where there are all kinds of electoral developments. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, if I were in that world, which I left, nearly 25 years ago, if I were there today, and if I were sort of parachuted in to help some of these people write speeches, the first thing that I would do would be to have a conversation with them and record it and listen to how they talk, not how they give a speech, how they talk. And I think that's really, really important. It's really, I mean, and to me, unfortunately, the word authentic triggers for me right now a BS.
So you see this authenticity as being kind of fake. It's actually the opposite.
Yeah, I think that authenticity has been hijacked by people who aren't authentic, unfortunately.
Yeah. Just sound like you.
Not to go too far. Sound like yourself.
But it's actually, I feel the same about writing, Dan, a little bit, where there are some writers I'm really I had Morgan House on recently. Psychology of Money, his books crushed it. I'm sure you like all that stuff. He writes like he talks, and when you talk to him, he sounds like Morgan Housel. And you're like, this is just him, and he's amazing. He's very smart, he's great. But I think that's part of the allure, and it's very similar to it is to you. I was just rewatching your TED Talk from 2009. You open with, it feels like you're sitting or you're standing. It feels like you're hanging out with your friends. You tell a joke about going to law school and being in the bottom 10% and not practicing law, but I am going to present you like with a case. And so it sounded this unique combination of self-deprecating humor, but an honest, real joke mixed with confidence in who you are as a person, and that's why it's got 30 plus million views and is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. I'm curious what you were thinking before that moment. Like, how did you prepare for that? How were you like the right level of preparedness to go out and absolutely destroy that stage in England that day?
Oh God, I barely even remember that.
Really?
Now remember, I want to say one thing. I'll answer that question. I'll think about it. But you mentioned self-deprecation. Self-deprecation without confidence is self-flagellation. So don't forget that. That is, if you're not truly confident, don't be self-deprecating, because it is going to, and also self-deprecation has, it's easier for me as a straight white man born in America to be self-deprecating. I think it's a little dicier if the audience is looking at you and somehow assuming that you're less competent than you would be, than a guy like who looks like me would be. So anyway, sorry. But forget about self-deprecation for now. What was I thinking? I don't know. I think I think my hunch is that I was thinking two things. Number one is that I was talking about some ideas on a book that I hadn't finished writing yet. So that's difficult. Uh, and the second thing was that is trying to keep a set of fairly complicated ideas within the boundaries of however long that was, 12, 13 minutes, whatever that was. And so I think that's what I was working on. The other aspect of it was that, and this is coaching they gave me. When I try to do a talk in a room in a particular place, I try to localize it and make it and have it meet the moment. And what they were encouraging me to do is not that, but instead do something that was a little bit more evergreen, because they were saying it's going to live on video far longer than it's going to live in the room. I think that was good advice at the time. But for a lot of what we do, for a lot of what people do when they're out speaking to groups or they're leading, I think it's really important to meet the moment, so that what you say on Tuesday at 3:30 in the afternoon in a November is not exactly the same as you would say, maybe thematically the same, but not exactly the same as you would say at 9 in the morning on a Thursday in March. So it's not candid. It meets the moment.
I
This is
think
one reason. Was one reason why, when I go out and do some, in the years where I've gone out and done a lot of speaking engagement, all the folks all the meeting planners and organizers, they want the slides and everything like 4 weeks in advance. And I have to say to them, it's like, it's 4 weeks from now. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do in 4 weeks, because I don't know what the world's going to be like in 4 weeks. And so I think meeting the moment is real. Just again trying to derive a lesson from that question, which is, I think it's important to meet the moment, meet the
yeah.
people, and meet the moment.
That's why I think it's good for communicators to study stand-up comedians, because
Absolutely.
they seem, I've seen some of the best ones. Their sets, now they're working on stuff, but the best ones actually try to spend time in the current location and meet that moment of maybe creating a 10-minute bit on the fly out of something they happened to see when they were walking through that small town in the Midwest. And when they are able to do that, you see documentaries or behind the scenes, you're like, wow, that really connects with an audience when you can meet the moment in that sense.
Stand-up comics are a great example of this. I think that they are a great example for writers, for any kind of talker, for any kind of performer, in part because the really good ones intimately, relentlessly workshop their material to the syllable sometimes. And I find that really inspiring. The other thing about stand-up comics that are worth studying in a way that writers of prose, like people like me who write books and articles and things like that, they get an immediate audience response, which is revealing. And the audience is usually right. The audience isn't always right, but the audience is, I should say, often right. You got to take what the audience says seriously. You can't simply dismiss it. So now, again, going back to your very first question, this is also something I learned in speechwriting. So one of the things that we would do, this is back, especially when I was working on, let's say that I was working for, I mean, back when I was working for Al Gore, and maybe he was, they were running for re-election. He and Clinton were running for re-election. This is a long time ago, running for re-election, and he would go to, I don't know, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And what we would do is we would do some due diligence on Sheboygan, Wisconsin. So he could say something like, I knew it was going to be a good morning when I woke up and smelled the aroma of coffee at McGillicuddy's Cafe, or it's like, I may be boring, but I'm not as boring as insert name of someone only people in Sheboygan would know.
Yeah.
And we used to call those how the hells, because we want the audience to say, how the hell did he know that? So
I love it. I told you before we started recording, the book that I've recently, over the last probably year or so, been gifting the most is To Sell is Human. I've actually said it on this podcast probably quite a bit when anybody brings it up, because my first 12 years of my career, I legitimately had a quota, carried it back.
Yeah.
Had to hit it every week, month, quarter, year. You know how it goes. And To Sell is Human is great for a sales professional, no doubt. It's a great book for that. However, it's great for people in general because we are all in sales every day. And sometimes the people who say, I would never work in sales, I hate salespeople, I'm not in sales, I will never do that. And I said, you actually do it every day. And that's the person I will hand your book to. And it's been too long since you and I have talked about selling. Now that time has passed since that's come out, I am curious about some of your ideas when it comes to updates, things you've learned from speaking about it on the road, people you've interacted with, maybe things you've changed your mind on. I'm curious now to get an update on To Sell is Human and how you feel about that and the impact it's legitimately had on the world.
Well, I don't know what kind of impact it's had on the world, but one of the things that I think was interesting in the reaction to that, because in that book, which is like 8 or 9 years old now,
Yep.
what I did is I made an argument at the outset, as you said, about how we're all in sales now, and that if you look at the guts of what white collar workers do, a huge portion of it is convincing, cajoling, persuading, and all that. And I wanted to make a very robust case for why that was true. And what I found was almost no resistance to that case. Truly. I mean, it's almost zero resistance, which surprised me, because like I was sort of in a sort of lawyerly way geared up to sort of meet people who would argue with me and who might say, no, you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about. And there was very little of it. What there was more than anything else was, okay, yeah, I get it. What do I do? And so I guess if I learned anything, if I had to do that over again, I would have the book, right? That book is balanced, maybe 1/3 argument and 2/3, news you can use. I think what I would do if I had it to do over again was closer to, 85, the 10%, 10 to 15% argument, and 85 to 90% news you can use. Because I got so little resistance to that. As for other things that I've learned out there, I mean, I think one of among the things that seem to have stuck really well, among the most important lessons there is the importance of making it easy for people to do things. That is, if you want someone to do something, we spend too much of our time trying to change people's minds and not enough time making it easy for them to act. And I think that's a really powerful, I think that's a really powerful lesson on everything, for design, for leadership, for marketing, for anything. And again, it goes to one of what we were talking about before, which is beginning with the end in mind. What do you want people to do? And before you start doing what I do as instinctively as a writer, is start marshaling the arguments in favor of it. The better thing to do at the outset is to say, I want them to do this. What can I do to make it as easy as possible for that person to do what I want them to do? And I think that's one of the really enduring lessons of it. Yeah, I think going back to Bob Cialdini's work, I don't think we have a good enough understanding of the importance of what he calls social proof, which is that when people are deciding what to do, they in anything, they don't only look into themselves, they look around to others for cues on how to do that. And so if you bring social proof into the room, this is one of Cialdini's big points. If you bring social proof into the room, you can be more persuasive. I think one of the interesting things is when do you appeal to kind of, when do you appeal to people's heads and when do you appeal to people's hearts? And that there's some nuance in that, but it isn't always one or the other. One isn't better than the other. There's another important principle also comes out of Cialdini and some other more contemporary work about that when people make that you have to trigger in some ways the compare to what question in any kind of persuasive encounter. People don't make decisions in absolute terms. They make decisions in relative terms. So they need a point of comparison. They need something to, they say, compared to what? So I think there are all kinds of really interesting lessons there for going back to some language. You see a little bit of it in speech writing happen naturally, is the importance of processing fluency in getting messages to stick. So processing fluency, does it go down easily? And so there are things that will increase processing fluency. Rhymes increase processing fluency. Lists increase processing fluency. Repetition increases processing fluency. Repetition increases processing fluency. Repetition increases processing fluency. So that there are various things that make it easy. When it goes down easier, the message is better understood and more likely to adhere. So I just think there are lots of really interesting. I think there's so much interesting stuff in there. I'm biased, obviously, because I wrote the freaking book, but I think there's a lot of good stuff.
Like I said, dude, there's no reason you could pick any book in the world. It's been the one I've been giving away and recommending the most to people of all ages, definitely people newer in their career, because they say they don't want to work in sales and they're going to work in sales. So I'm going to drill down on a few of those, though. It's funny, the social proof one. It's like if an event planner books Dan Pink, they're going to look really good to their boss and to the event people because you've created so much social proof and you're so good at speaking. I don't know how much speaking you're doing now, but I would bet there were large portions of your career where you've literally lived out the social proof, because if someone can say, well, we booked Dan Pink, then they're like, this planner's awesome. Then they're great because you created so much.
But you could use it in sales too. So if you say, you're selling computer systems and you're like, oh, well, yeah, no, we it's proven pretty popular. Accenture just bought this system. And
people put the logos on their own website, right? Here's
exactly,
all the logos.
Precisely. Right? It's a better, more vivid explanation of that.
How about the making it easy for people to do things? Because this one, I 100% like. Do you have an example or a thought on how someone, let's say, whether they're trying to actually sell something or just convince somebody or persuade, making it easy for someone else to be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Let's do that.
There's all kinds of practical examples rooted in the research on this, and they're fascinating. So one of them would be, there's an old study showing, let's say you want students at a university to donate food to the hungry. So it's a food drive at a university, and you want them to donate food to the hungry. The best thing you can do is tell the students what kind of food you want give them a map showing where the receptacles are, and giving them a follow-up phone call. Telling them, tugging their heartstrings about the importance of hunger or anything like that, not that great. Think about voting. There's some good research on good research on voting. You can tell people, oh, it's important to, you can make the argument for why it's important to live out America's democratic creed and to exercise your rights of self-expression, or you can work with people to develop a plan for what they're going to do on voting day. What time are you going to vote? How are you going to get there? Okay. Oh, okay. Do you need a ride there? Oh, you need a ride there. Okay. That's it. So we're not making arguments about civic responsibility. We're making it easy for them to do things. Another really great example having to do with choice architecture is a famous example of 401ks, where people would go into a company, they'd be offered a 401k with a match, and they wouldn't sign up for it. And so you had all this exhortation about the importance of saving for retirement, of why you needed to prepare for the future, of why you should put money away. And still, it didn't really work. And what worked was changing the default. So you just so people were opted in. You could still opt out, but basically, we'll check the box for you. It went up from something. My numbers aren't quite right; they're directionally right. Something from like 60-something% of people contributing to the 401k to 90-something people contributing from the 401k. Not because of what we think of as persuasion of, hey, here's a catchy jingle, here's an argument, here's a compelling chart, but essentially saying, we'll check the box for you. So I think that is an incredibly important lesson, and it goes back again, as I said, to working backwards. What outcome do you want? And thinking about it in those terms.
Make it easy. The heads and hearts. So how do you know when to appeal to what? What's an example of the head or heart or both? Like, how does that work?
It depends. So there is, as a rough guide, I think there's an argument for using your heart is using sort of emotion and empathy when you're persuading down, and using a more hard-headed approach when you're persuading up, based on some research here. So one of the things that you see is, and it really has to do with the effect of feelings of power on people's perspective taking. In general, the more powerful somebody feels, the worse their perspective taking abilities are. And perspective taking is essential in any kind of persuasive effort, because I need to understand where you're coming from so I can find common ground. I'm not trying to coerce you to do something. I don't have any coercive power. What I want to do is, hey, where are you coming from? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are your interests? What are your emotions? And what do you want? And can I find common ground with you? And we know that power can distort those perspective taking abilities. So what you see now is that, for instance, in general, high status people tend to be pretty bad perspective takers in general, and low status people tend to be very good perspective takers because they don't have the power, they don't have the resources. And so in general, this is a very, very rough rule of thumb, is that if you are a boss persuading down, you should sort of lower your feelings of power in order to increase the acuity of your perspective taking. So if I were to try to persuade you to do something and I were your boss, instead of kind of saying, Ryan, I'm your boss, go, da, 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 is actually lower your perspective taking, at certain times, lower your perspective taking and say, Ryan doesn't seem like he wants to do this. I really need Ryan. Ryan is really good. We need him on our team. What can I do better to make this in Ryan's interest? And you can lower your perspective you can lower your feelings of power, find that common ground. You don't do this all the time in every single thing, but it is a technique. When you're persuading up, I think there's a strong argument for focusing on interests over emotions. My view is that bosses tend to group people into two categories: people who make my life easier, people who make my life harder. And you want to be in that first category. That's advice I give to my own kids when they have bosses. Like, if you have a boss, your boss is going to put you in one of two categories. You make my life easier, you make my life harder. And you want to be in that first category.
Absolutely. It's funny, Dan, I was work with some senior leaders who, message to their team, the people that work for them, and they also have board meetings at least every quarter, at least. And we were preparing for, this is years ago, but preparing for a board meeting. And this company, these leaders, they're very big on their culture and their values and how they live out these values. And when they speak about that with the people they're leading, the people at their company, it seems to resonate well. It's emotional. I think it's heart-centered. But one of the earlier board meetings, they're sharing some of the similar messaging with the members of the board about values and culture and all this stuff. And the board members like, dude, we don't care. We don't care. Like, just get to the stuff that we care about. And so, like, that's a prime example of, and they learned after that first meeting, okay, they don't care about that stuff. There's a bottom line. There are numbers. They want to see how we're growing versus the numbers and the goals set. All that stuff is very important to us, and it is part of our messaging with our people, but the messages are different based on the audience. And if we're with our people, they actually don't want to hear about as much of kind of the financials. They want to hear about the heart stuff and the mission and the values and the behaviors and the purpose of the company. Whereas the board members are like, dude, just give us the stuff that we care about. Are we growing? Are we hitting our numbers? Yes. Okay, great. Then you guys go do whatever you want to do. It's kind of interesting that you got to understand your audience based, and then your message needs to be written or thought about based upon who those people are. So I think that heart and head really makes a lot of sense.
On your example, I'll take it even a step further, which is advice. If you do want to talk about your culture and you want the board's buy-in on the culture, I think you lead with the interests. You lead with the results. You say, hey, board, you wouldn't believe it, but we have come up with an incredible way to increase our quarterly profits and quarterly revenue and our quarterly profits. And it's a technique that we're using that costs almost no money, but it seems to be delivering bottom line results quarter after quarter after quarter. Are you interested? And and then go in and talk about the culture. It's sort of like when people will want, say they want more remote work, they want hybrid. And so they go in there and say, boss, I'm really burnt out. I really need to do hybrid work. I really need to do 2 days a week at home. I miss my kids. I'm not self-actualizing fast enough. When instead, what they should be doing is saying, hey, boss, I got a great way for me to be even more productive. I got a great way to increase the amount that I achieve for you by probably 10% without cost and actually saving the company money. But once again, this is interesting because I think it's becoming a theme of this conversation is you have to have clarity about what you want to happen. Like, don't walk into your boss's office unless you know what outcome you want.
Yep.
And then work backward from that outcome. I don't think that you should work backward from an outcome in every single encounter you have in life. No way. But in these kinds of encounters that we're talking about, what outcome do you want? And then design your approach based on that.
It's the same way with like hiring. If you're interviewing for a job, that person that's interviewing has some sort of problem that needs to be solved. And that's what I think should be the focus. That's how you talked about the two different people. You make my life better, make my life worse as a boss. You're thinking, regardless of the job, how am I going to help solve your problem as
exactly.
the boss? That's what I'm here to share, is how I can help solve your problem. It's not about me. It's about you and your problem, how I am the solution. I will solve it.
Amen. I've been on the interviewer side of those kinds of things where I've interviewed people and the interview is about how great doing this assignment or doing this project would be for them. And I'm like, dude, like, I'm paying you to solve my problem.
Exactly. Well, let's get into Drive a little bit too, right? Because I think that's one of the other books that absolutely just took the world by storm. And I think autonomy, mastery, and purpose just comes up over and over, and it's been written about in probably hundreds or even thousands of books since Drive came out. So you did deep research on essentially what people are motivated by, how we can inspire people, how we can move people, and the really the three things that came up were autonomy, mastery, and purpose. What what have you learned since that has come out? What have maybe some thinking you've updated? How have you seen that impact have on companies when you're out speaking on the road, or if you're consulting or helping with companies? What is the stuff you learned from Drive? How has it impacted people now since that's come out?
Well, again, it's hard for companies to enact sometimes because it's much easier to give people high stakes contingent rewards and say, if you do this, then you get this big reward. If you don't do this, then I'm going to fire you. And what you get then are you get short term action, no question about it. People will scurry, and because many companies are so short term focused, they're so myopic that they end up doing that rather than this tougher thing, which is to say, what can I do as a boss? What can we do as a company to make sure that Ryan has the right level of control over what he does, how he does it, who he does it with? How can we help put Ryan in a position where he's making progress on meaningful work, where he's getting better at something that matters? How can we help Ryan understand what he does every day is connected to some other kind of purpose? That's a lot harder. So I think that there's still some execution barriers there, just because the more effective long-term way of doing things is more difficult than the short-term way of doing things. And the short-term way is effective in the short term. It can be useless or even counterproductive in the long term, but in the short term, it gets people moving. Beyond that, in terms of updated thinking, I think that I've updated my thinking a little bit on purpose. In the book Drive, I talked about purpose as essentially a cause larger than yourself, so that people want to understand how what they do each day achieves something far beyond the self. And I use a lot of kind of highfalutin things about whether it's climate change or housing or those kinds of big transcendent things, and I missed an element of purpose, which I like to think of as small p purpose. Capital P purposes are changing the world. Small p purpose, though, is just making a contribution internally. That is, it's a motivator to help your teammate get a project out the door. It's a motivator to make this one customer's life better, if you can, in that moment. It's a motivator to even, obviously to provide for your kids. And so there are different kinds of, to me, their purpose is not one thing, but it's two things. There's capital P purpose. Am I making a difference in the world? And small p purpose, which is simply, am I making a contribution, locally in some way?
And you've learned that people feel the small p purpose, like that's a really big motivator that
Small p purpose is totally legit. It's totally powerful, and I overlooked it at first. And it's important not to overlook that,
yeah,
because in our day-to-day work, we don't always have capital P purpose at our fingertips.
right.
But we often have small p purpose at our fingertips.
I think to build a culture with that type of purpose too, as a leader, it's on us to highlight and shine a bright light on those who live that out. And that, because you kind of get what you create or what you allow, right? Dr. Henry Cloud stuff. And I think that seems to apply with more of those small p purpose. Like, I'm going to highlight the fact that my guy, Jameson Harkey, who is a great sales professional, happens to also take great pride in being an amazing mentor to somebody who's brand new. And I watch how he dedicates extra time to doing that. And so, like, we're going to highlight that behavior. I think that is making a contribution to the team that probably won't be noticed on a grand scale. But as me, as the leader or the manager of that team, that's the type of culture that I want. So we got to highlight some of those small p purpose actions and behaviors by your team if that's what you want to continue to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the autonomy part, so that a lot has changed since it's come out now with hybrid type working, remote style jobs. There's more autonomy, I think, for people to work on their own time because they're not necessarily, a lot of them are not going into an office as much now, at least as they were when Drive came out. What have you learned, or what do you think about autonomy since the world has shifted since this originally came out?
I mean, not to be too self congratulatory, but I think it shows that I was right.
Yes.
Because I've been writing about remote work and working at home for a very long time. I wrote about it in my very first book, Free Nation, which is 20 years ago.
Yep.
And at the time, people said, "Oh no, you can't have people working at home. You can't have people working remotely. The technology is not there, and you can't trust people to do it." And then, 4 years ago, we had an international experiment involving hundreds of millions of people who somehow managed to figure it out in 4 days and did it for 2 years, and it worked fine. And I think that has created a pretty significant change. You see this with the big banks who for years, I mean, literally, I think some are still doing it, are imploring people, you got to come back. You're really committed. You're in the office 5 days a week. And talented people saying, okay, great. Okay. I'll go take my talents. I'll go take my talents somewhere else. So I think that there's been a big proof of concept on autonomy, and you see it in the numbers on people working remotely and their productivity levels. That said, autonomy is not the only virtue in a workplace, and I am not for many jobs. I'm not for 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year remote. I'm not for that at all. I don't think that's actually a good thing. But giving people some kind of sovereignty to spend some of their time at home and some of their time in the office is important, because what it does is it forces us to think through a pretty fundamental question that we hadn't wrestled with before, is like, what kind of work should be done alone and heads down? What kind of work should be done together and collaboratively? And we haven't had a good answer to that question. And the move to remote work is forcing us to confront that question. Not that long ago, I would go into companies, and what you would have is people sitting in long rows, working on their computer, headphones on, doing completely heads down work by themselves. Why do we need to ship them downtown to do that? Mm-hmm. And so if that's a facet of their job, they should be able to do that anywhere else. I wrote about this in Free Nation. If that's a facet of their job, they should be able to do that anywhere else. And when they come into the office, there has to be a purpose. I think there's a big value in coming into the office. That's what I don't think most places should be 100% remote. I really don't think that. There's a value to being physically present with other human beings. However, it has to be intentional. Mm-hmm. If I'm sitting next to you in a line of cubicles and we're all have our headphones on and we're interacting only with our computers, that's not collaborative. I don't need to come to an office for that. That said, we also have sort of the converse of that, which is that some interesting research has come out having to do with iteration and brainstorming and creativity, and it's less effective on Zoom than it is in person. I think that tells us something. So we're trying to sort this out. What should we do together, collaboratively? What kind of should we do alone, heads down in our own private Idaho? And I think sorting that out is a really important question. And just events forced us to do that. Otherwise, we would have just kept sort of sliding into this status quo that was suboptimal.
Yep. I know for me, growing up in a sales environment for 12 years, in a cubicle for part of those years, listening to my colleagues make calls, sitting with them sitting with me, the in-between call conversations. I mean, three of the people I sat near in those cubicles were in my wedding. I mean, that tells you how close you can get to people like that.
Yeah.
And so to me, and they're still some of my best friends to this day, and that was a while ago, that the combination of the social element, I think it helps speed up learning for that type of job, like you're saying, like that is one that it helps. There still could have been a hybrid element to that, though, where there's a bit of both, because you can do some of the job not in there, but it helps to be there. So like you said, it's nuanced, but autonomy is like, I feel like you're just ahead of your time in a lot of the things you've written about. Now that you
Ha!
talk about Free Agent Nation, you talk about autonomy. Like, I'm just curious, like, what's the thing you're thinking about now that you can almost tell the future? Like, you got anything in your mind now that you think like, oh, this could be happening a decade from now or longer?
Um, I mean, I don't know. All kinds of things. One of the issues I think that is going to be emerging is the importance of not only knowledge and skills, but wisdom, which I think is something different. Wisdom, I think, is going to play a bigger role in a world where AI, especially generative AI, can do all kinds of things. I mean, generative AI makes obsolete when generative AI gets a little bit better, it's going to make obsolete some of the arguments in a book I wrote called A Whole New Mind, where I suggested that computers, software, et cetera, would have a very difficult time doing creative, iterative, artistic kinds of things. I don't think that AI is going to replace everybody at all, but I do think that it will. I mean, this is hackneyed too. AI. It's like I buy the argument when people say AI isn't going to take your job, but somebody using AI could take your job if you're not using it.
By the way, I was just watching your master class again. I know I'm jumping around, but this was a really good story. I thought that would be useful. And these two scholars went to a lot of Hollywood pitch meetings you were talking
Yeah.
about in this class. And to see, it really, because I think pitching is something that, regardless if you are someone who does that or not, it's useful to understand what works because it's about, I guess, persuasion, but it's also about getting people on your side of the table. So two scholars went to a lot of Hollywood pitch meetings to see what was effective, what wasn't. What did they find were the most effective elements of the people whose pitches worked?
Yeah, this is a really great study, and it changed the way I pitch things. So we tend to think that pitching is about I'm pitching something to you, and what I'm essentially trying to do is convert you on the spot. That it's a conversion exercise. I want you to see the light and come to the Lord and sign up with me. When in fact that's the wrong way to do it. The best pitches are essentially invitations to collaborate. And the ones that were most effective invited in the other person as a kind of co-creator. And those were the ones that were successful. I don't know if they delineated this specifically, but I think we can infer a couple of the reasons for that. The first is that it probably produced better ideas. If I make a pitch to you and say we should do X, Y, and Z, and you say, "Oh, that's interesting. Have you ever thought about doing Q also instead of Z?" And you're like, "Oh man, that's a good idea. Yeah, we should do that." All right. So it makes the idea better. The other thing is that it gives you some agency.
Mm.
And if you're the decider, when deciders have agency, they like that. So I think there's something to that. It's also so that's how I've sort of changed the way that I pitch. I used to pitch in a kind of more of a kind of song and dance vaudeville show, yada 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 yada, and then wait for the applause. And that's a stupid way to do it.
Have you seen by chance the TV show called The Offer?
No.
Okay, it's on Paramount Plus. It stars Miles Teller. And it's about Miles plays the role of this guy named Albert Ruddy, who is the producer who got the movie The Godfather made. Right? So it's
Okay.
like they make a TV show about how The Godfather went from a book to a movie. And it's really stars how the producer was able to I had no idea it was such a process to get this thing
Yeah,
made, but it
I had no
was. So
idea.
anyway, Albert Ruddy meets the mob. Apparently, the guys were not excited about The Godfather being made into a movie. And there's this mob boss named Joe Colombo who basically pulls the Miles Teller character aside and he says, "This is not happening. Like, you are not making this movie. It's going to make us look bad. It's going to be bad for Italian Americans, all this stuff." And the Albert Ruddy, who's Miles Teller plays the role, says, "Hey, why don't you come read the script and offer notes and I'll make changes based on what you think to make sure that it doesn't make Italian Americans or it doesn't make you guys look bad or the mafia or whatever." And the whole dynamic, I know it's a TV show, but the whole dynamic of the room changes. And the guy, Joe Colombo, the mob boss, actually comes to the office. He shares the script with him, and he shared it with nobody else. And just the act of like saying, I'm willing, like, we're co creators here, we're collaborators here. It went from Joe Colombo saying, this is not happening, to saying, we're like friends. And they actually became friends. And obviously, the movie got made. It's one of the greatest of all time. And so it's amazing how he viewed it. This producer viewed this really tough situation that actually could have been life or death. I mean, these guys didn't mess around, and said, no, no, we're going to collaborate on this. So when he pitched them, it was, we're in this together, as opposed to, I'm going to convince you to make this thing happen. I think it's a really great example of that.
Absolutely. Invite people in as a collaborator.
How would that work in like a sales environment? They're like I'm selling a multi-million dollar, multi-year SaaS product to you, the head of whatever. What like how would it work in a situation
Here's
like
what we
that?
have now. Here's our offering right now. What advice do you have for making it better? What advice do you have for improving this product?
Yeah.
This is complicated. I know it's a big decision for you, and we probably haven't got. Ours is very good, but we don't have it perfectly. What do you think? Those kinds of things, I think, are really effective.
Big, and just being curious, right? Ask questions, be curious, right? 9 years ago when we talked for the first time, I asked you about the commonalities of leaders who sustain excellence, and the very first thing you said was, they're curious, they follow their nose, they ask good questions. I think that's great. I'm curious now about this column in the Washington Post called "Why Not?" And I've looked at the recent articles you've written, in that you're also kind of working with readers and fans of yours. Can you tell me a little bit more about this column, Why Not? What made you want to do it? What are some of the most enjoyable ones you've written about recently?
Well, we decided to do for the opinion page of the Washington Post. We felt that I and the editors there felt that there was, what is scarce, and what is abundant. So what's abundant are opinions, and so they're not worth that much. What's scarce is possibility, and so that's worth
Mm.
more. So we decided to write an opinion column around the concept of possibility, and offer. Not trying to convert people, but just trying to have a conversation. Not trying to offer the last word, but maybe sometimes offering the first word. And so what we do is I write these columns about sort of throwing out an idea for improving America, for boosting organizations, for improving individual lives, and then explore the possibilities of it. We've written, let's see, why not spark up the Olympics by including, this is a great idea, like an Olympic cooking competition. Can you imagine international Olympic cooking? That would be the
Awesome.
biggest TV draw ever. The other idea for the Olympics are intergenerational relays. We have mixed relays on gender. So how about having relays where you have somebody under 20, somebody from 20 to 39,
Oh,
somebody from 40 to 60, and somebody from 60 plus? How about that as a way to break down age-based stereotypes? I have an idea for citizen participation in the Olympics, where citizens of the world could essentially sign up to be on their Olympic team, and over the course of the Olympic weeks, they could count their steps, and those steps would count toward their country's Olympic medal on this particular competition. So
mm.
we got that whacked out idea. I wrote about, why not pay teachers $100,000 a year as a minimum salary. Teachers are woefully underpaid. So why not just boost that salary up to at least $100,000 a year? It's enormously expensive, but if we care about education, maybe we should do that. I have some ideas for reconfiguring our national holidays. The pet peeve of mine is that I want to get rid of left turns in the busiest intersections in our busiest cities, because they cause a lot of pain and death, and they slow traffic down. And when you eliminate them, traffic actually moves faster and is safer. I propose that Vice President Harris, instead of picking a single running mate, pick a team of running mates, which I still think is a good idea, even though she didn't listen to me. And so we're just throwing things out there, seeing how readers respond. Readers have sent in right now, I'd have to check the database, but I think we're well over 5,000 ideas from readers. So what we're trying to do is have a conversation, not as I said before, not convert people, but have a conversation, and give people a sense of possibility. Right now,
Mm.
there's so much cynicism. There's so much cynicism And what and cynicism is there are you can have a little dollop of cynicism, but cynicism is generally not a great quality. And when there's a head fake out there, in the research, it's called the cynical genius illusion, that we think that people who are cynical are smarter, and they're
Yep.
not. What we know about intelligence is that intelligence correlates very much with a psychological trait of openness. Are you open to new ideas? So we're trying to prize openness over cynicism, conversation over conversion, um, and the first word over the last word.
Do you come up with these ideas? I know they send in ideas too, but like the left turn thing, the Olympics thing, or is it kind of a group effort and then you expand based on the ideas you receive? Because I'm curious about idea generation. Usually you need so much quantity just to get to the quality, but you're an idea guy. So how do you
Right
get to
now, right now, right now, I've come up with all the ideas, but there are plenty of really interesting ideas from a lot of really interesting ideas from a lot of really interesting ideas from readers that I'm going to end up pursuing
I
when I
love it
run out
because
of gas. When I run
I
out of
think,
gas.
like from an innovation perspective, ideas. I think of Jesse Cole from the Savannah Bananas. Right, he writes his 10 ideas every single day. A lot of them, aren't good, but that's what it
Absolutely.
takes. That's what it
Amen.
takes in order to get to the good stuff. Dan, this is
Amen.
awesome, man. Thank you so much again for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm gifting your books more than any right
Thank
now,
you.
and I have for years. I love you, man, and I certainly want to continue our dialogue as we both progress.
What a pleasure talking with you again. Let's do it again in 9 years.
Maybe a little sooner. All right. Thanks, man.